Hello, everyone. My name is Roon, and today I'm guest hosting a special episode of Tomorrow Talk with Matt Krisiloff, the founder of Conception, the ex-director of Y Combinator Research, and a founding team member of OpenAI. And I'm super excited to learn what he's up to these days. So Matt, let's just start off with what does Conception do? Explain it to a layman, and then maybe we'll get deeper into the technical details.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me here. So Conception basically is developing a means of turning a type of stem cell called an induced pluripotent stem cell into human egg. We think this would be a really big deal for fertility purposes. Assuming it works safely, it'd allow women to have children at a much older age, into their 40s and 50s, because it's often egg decline. That's the reason women can't end up having children. Could potentially allow same-sex couples to be able to have children together, which is the main reason I'm interested in it as a technology. Potentially down the line too, if there's the right ethical framework, really open the door as well for much wider genetic selection and even one day potentially genetic editing of embryos. So it's a really, really powerful technology that I'm excited to be developing.
That makes sense. So I like how you have that long-term vision for it, where maybe downstream we're talking about iterated selection of genomes or artificial wombs and that kind of stuff. So what would you say the end game vision for Conception is, I guess?
Yeah, I really think it can sound kind of crazy, but assuming it's safe, I really think there's a version out there that someday this could be the way people choose to have children by default. Really, if you can imagine a future where people essentially can take a blood sample, we can isolate the right cells, turn those into the right stem cells to make eggs that are viable. Really, you could just with that blood sample end up making vast quantities of eggs and ultimately a high number of embryos as well. And so with that, it would be much more doable compared to what it is with IVF right now, where you go through hormone injections, a surgical procedure, and just end up with maybe 10 embryos if you're lucky, to do a much wider look at selection potentials for that. So that's the really long term out there example. I think there's a lot of practical nearer term benefit for a lot of people in the world that have fertility issues right now. But yeah, I don't think it's crazy to imagine that long term possibility.
Right. That's awesome. And when I hear about in vitro gametogenesis, usually the people talk most about same-sex couples being able to have kids, but it seems like the much bigger market that you mentioned is just elder women, right, who are still able to have kids but have depleted their egg cells. What is the market size for that?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite a large population. It's a little hard to estimate because it's one of those things where it's opening up a new market
Right.
if it ends up being successful for whole swaths of people that just don't have that possibility of even thinking about this right now. But on the margins, right now with IVF, it's not uncommon to have to go through 3, 4, 5, even more IVF cycles for someone that's really determined to try and have a child and still have that not work out. So there are already these highly motivated people that don't have options, that are just left behind on the fringe at the moment, that this would be able to address. But I do think the numbers of people this could benefit could be quite significant, especially as you think about as well. There's so many people that are wanting these days to be having children later and later. So if you can open that door where it just becomes the norm for a couple to have children in their 40s, that would be a really cool thing.
Right, absolutely. Do you ever think about things like fertility crisis and what technologies like this might help avert or prevent?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that example alone of really opening a door for women to have children at an older age could make a big dent into this type of problem, let's say, that the world will be facing over time. I think that's definitely part of it now. There's a lot of people that might feel jaded or not wanting children for whatever reason in their 20s or 30s, but when they reach that later point in life, their outlook might look a little bit different, and this is an opportunity for doing that. I do think this is one piece amongst other technologies that will be helpful for addressing fertility issues more broadly. But yeah, I do think it can be a significant piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Right, those numbers look a little scary, right? Like it seems that every single country that reaches, developed world status does no longer has kids at like replacement level, right? So we're gonna need things like this, and maybe even crazier technologies to fix that. Or do you think it's not really a problem? What's your take on it?
I think it's a problem for sure,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And I think it's going to be something that's increasingly talked about. I think if and when we get a handle on climate change discussion and solutions, like I could very easily seeing it becoming the next big thing that just global society is very aware of and trying to address.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right.
yeah, I mean, there are obviously like people in the world that don't view this as a problem and are
Mm-hmm.
antinatalist to some degree, even. But
Right.
yeah, personally, I think it's going to be something that the world will marshal many more resources towards trying to figure out the right cultural structure to be addressing this.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely like super underaddressed. Okay, so there's a seminal paper that like you have on your website and you've talked about a few times about the mice study, right, where they successfully did in vitro gametogenesis, and it actually turned into was it a viable offspring? I forget, embryo
Yep.
or
Yeah, they
offspring.
were able to make viable mice
Hmm.
that went on to be able to have natural, healthy offspring of their own as well.
That's amazing. Okay, so it's like full germline reproduction. What are the difficulties in translating from the mice study to the human? I mean, this is the entire company, so it's a kind
Yeah,
of a difficult question, but I guess the key points.
yeah. For me, like the biggest reason, like why when I was looking at this, it was not going to move as quickly as it possibly could was really a
Hmm.
resource allocation thing. Um, Working on the human system, the cells are a bit more delicate than
Hmm.
mice cells are. Mice cells are just generally more robust for a lot of manipulation processes for whatever reason.
Hmm.
Um, the timelines are much longer for human. Like the
Right.
full mouse gestational cycles under a month versus in human, it's 9 months, obviously. And we have and can cut down that amount of time while still um, being faithful to the proper development process. But it's still like a lengthier development process where iterating on that properly
Hmm.
requires a lot more resources and people engaged with basically repeating experiments over and over a greater set of time, testing different variables in those experiments. All that to say, like we have been finding that these are surmountable challenges and have been able on our end to make a very significant degree of progress over the years we've been working on this.
Hmm. So how do you think about those things where like there may be downstream effects on fetal development, because you can't really trial and error this, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things. Like animal models, definitely very important for this. One of the cool things about IVF is that in the gold standard, the embryos are developing in essentially a petri dish for 6 days before you go on and transplant them. So that means that in those 6 days, like the endpoints of embryo development are actually quite analyzable.
Hmm.
Um, and that can be used to benchmark the embryos that we'll be creating with our stem cell derived egg cells directly to those. So there's a lot we're going to be able to tell by doing analysis of our embryos compared to gold standard IVF embryos. We'll be doing all sorts of sequencing, morphological analysis, and yeah, we should be able to have a better basis if these are comparable than potentially for other cell therapies where you need billions of cells essentially that you transplant in, and it's hard to characterize on like a cell by cell basis if everything is working properly. Assuming we have enough of a confident safety profile amongst the testings we are doing, then yeah, I think trying this with willing couples that really understand the risks and want to have children, like a small number of them, I think will be something we'll have to jump to at some point.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And so I have like a nonsense question, so feel free to give me
Sure.
like a nonsense answer, but like, in 10 years, what do you hope the cost of this thing for like, one patient would be?
I expect it to be pretty expensive in
Hmm.
10 years. Um, like I would expect, like best case, we've only been on the market even for a couple of years at that
Hmm.
point, if everything's going right. But yeah, I think equivalent to other cell therapies in terms of the current cost structures that haven't had the enabling technologies to bring them down. I
Right.
wouldn't be surprised if it's a couple $100,000 to um, be able to do this properly.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Got it. And you think that price will go down in the long run with automation, with vision models, all this kind of stuff?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. I've listened to like a few of the other things you've done, like the shows you've appeared on, and it kind of sounds like, you are like very hardcore in this biological acceleration category, where things like you've talked about artificial wombs. I guess, what does utopia look like for you in that camp? Like, what does the version of, we can do perfect CRISPR editing with like little side effects, we can do artificial wombs, like, what does that world look like?
Yeah. I guess like one thing I'll say in terms of the artificial womb stuff is I think it's like much, much further off than
Definitely,
what
yeah.
we're doing right
Hmm.
now. I think like, yeah, you need to properly support complex organ structures that way over a
Hmm.
significant period of time. And that's going to be like a super hard challenge. I don't think we have the right tools as a society at this point to be doing exactly right.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, I part of this for me is like still like the core original inspiration of just helping people to be able to have children that can't. Um, like again, for me, like my main motivation for this is the potential that could allow gay guys like me to be able to have children together. I think that's like really cool. And
Right.
if it's an option that's there and it's safe, it's something I would want for myself. But likewise, I mean, even if you take something like genetic selection or germline editing,
Hmm.
um, there are still plenty of people right now that would be passing on um, some kind of genetic disease that would just make that unviable
Hmm.
as an offspring, or an offspring that wouldn't be able to have like a healthy, happy life. And I do think it makes sense at some point, at least with the right frameworks, to be creating this stuff and
Hmm.
going through the right safety regulatory processes
Hmm.
to actually bring that into existence.
Yeah.
Um, I can definitely imagine a world where this can go far afield in terms
Uh-huh.
of, will there be questions along the ethical debates of, are we creating superhumans, or um, vanity types of changes, or even just selection, which selection, I should say, as well, is already done commonly in IVF right now. There's
Right.
already quite regularly various genetic selection tests already done. But I can definitely imagine, again, the world that this goes a lot wider. And I think, at least in the disease point of view, there's not a reason that um,
There's not a reason we shouldn't, right? We should
not a reason we shouldn't,
create.
unless it's
Yeah.
safe. Not
Right.
safe.
Hmm.
That would be the only reason in my head. And then the rest of this ends up being like a black and white
Hmm.
spectrum rather than just, uh, you know, purely a yes or no type of thing.
Right. And probably different people, different societies will land on different parts of that spectrum, right?
For sure. And I think that's totally fine too.
What is like, what is the game theory there, I guess? Like, because it seems to me that if one society decides that, they're okay with any kind of editing, like creating superhumans or whatever, like people that are taller, anything, then does everyone else have to follow suit? Is it like a real choice, I guess?
Yeah. So
Hmm.
selection, editing for
Hmm.
disease purposes, like that to me is very clear cut. Like if it's
Hmm.
safe, I don't see a reason not to be doing it. Of course, have to respect wherever the regulatory guidelines in the world are at this point. But
Hmm.
I don't see why, for disease purposes, it's unreasonable to do those types of things, especially when in adult humans we're already doing those types of things as well.
Hmm.
Um, for more like superfluous types of things, like, yeah, I mean, I think like I don't have a super, super strong opinion on it.
Yeah.
I think like um, definitely needs to be discussed more. Definitely, like, we'll need to get to some type of regulatory consensus on how to be doing those types of stuff. But to the other part of your question there, like, yeah, I think there are going to be certain societies that do this first. I think
Hmm.
that's going to change the narrative. Again,
Yeah.
assuming it's safe in terms of how other groups will think about it. There's been many technologies throughout history where that's been the case, where there's been a lot of fear around something.
Hmm.
IVF itself was like a super, super um, feared thing before it really got out there. Now it's like, for the most part, a pretty mundane, normal thing. So
Right.
it's consistent with trends of many technologies in terms of how they
Right.
end up being developed. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there's still some countries for sure that will never want this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's totally fine, I think.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because certainly 25 years ago, 30 years ago, there was this whole thing about test tube babies and like it was like an actually morally sensitive or ethically sensitive topic. And now there's like, millions of like IVF babies walking around, right? So it's like that debate kind of completely ended, and it seems that the morality around that thing, like, it became a non-issue, right? So when people tell me like, artificial wombs are never going to take off because it's like too weird and too sensitive, it seems like weird and sensitive is a moving target, right? Um,
Yeah.
but it's like it's interesting because it raises the question like, will with this sort of biological biotechnological acceleration, will people enjoy like what 50 years from now looks like, I guess? Like, will they find it alien? I'm sure that, in
Yeah.
terms of pure utility optimization, we're going to be way ahead of where we are today. But how do you think about that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm curious what you think. Like, you these days contemporaneously are much more steeped in AI world and how all of that stuff
Yeah.
is changing. I think in some ways these things will collide for sure, but
Hmm.
uh, yeah, I'd be more worried about how that's going to
Definitely.
affect utility than how what I'm working on will necessarily.
Yeah. So the other day I was reading Werner Vinci. He has this like famous essay on like technological singularities, and he has like four different singularity types in the essay. Um, and one of them is AI singularity. The other one is like a biological singularity that caused by, iterated genetic selection. Um, and he's kind of like, any of these singularities will trigger all the other ones. Meaning that if you have AI that is recursively self-improving or something like that, probably you will accelerate biotech research very rapidly too, right? Um, so, like, do you think about that? And you were obviously the founding member or one of the founding members of OpenAI, which is now having like massive breakthroughs. How will that field affect your field, I guess?
Yeah. Um, I mean, a lot, obviously, like the
Hmm.
computational tools that are already being used um, at leading edge life science work these days um, are incredibly helpful.
Hmm.
Like single cell RNA sequencing is one of like the backbone tools we end up using for a lot of the stuff we end up doing.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's going to continue to expand. I think there are like some aspects though where like certain things like we're just not going to have the data sets to be able to interpret properly until
Yeah.
we get those in real world context. So um yeah, like what genetic like across an entire genome, what exactly correlates to what phenotypically, I think it's going to take a generation to like have a whole hand on that to some degree.
Got it.
But the tools will be powerful. I think
Hmm.
like um, I'm definitely not saying, to be clear, we should go and do iterated
Uh-huh.
uh,
Right, right, right.
data selection.
Hmm.
Um, but I think the possibility there is to like increase certain traits by 20-30%
Hmm.
over a relatively short amount of time wouldn't necessarily be difficult. I think in like the cattle industry, for example, um, we've already seen examples of this around meat, dairy production type of thing. And so you could push on certain things in humans. Again, I'm not saying like
Right,
should we do this, but
right, right.
these are going to be questions that get talked about in our lifetime.
Definitely. Okay, yeah. I think I'm kind of on the same page there. So I want to
I think,
know.
yeah. Sometimes I like to say in like the world where like AGI does not end up working out, like
Uh-huh.
the realm of topics I'm working on, I think will be um, some of the biggest topics of
Yeah.
lifetimes and over the next 100 years.
Hmm.
In the world where AGI gets created in 10, 15, 20 years or something, I don't know what everything ends up looking like.
Right. Do you think AGI, like, what is your AGI timeline? I guess it's the
I don't
most
know. I
popular
always think
question these days.
it's kind of a silly question, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, fair enough. What was your time at OpenAI like? What did it look like then? Like, did you expect it growing into this, like, seemingly like a generational company?
Yeah, I mean, it- really, really positive experience and very
Hmm.
helpful for me. I was like pretty early on in my career. I had worked on a mental health therapy company like during college and right after college, and then ended up meeting Sam and coming to work at YC originally,
Hmm.
helping start a program there. I ended up in the position where I had more time on my hands, so I really wanted to help out with OpenAI and
Hmm.
started doing that in connection with YC because it was attached to YC at the very, very beginning. And it was just clearly such a special group of people. I mean,
Hmm.
it had Sam, it had Ilya, it had Greg, Wojciech, John. Like a lot of the core team was already there from the very, very start. Andre Karpathy was there in the early days as well, and everyone was like highly, highly motivated. Um, Elon back then was like pretty involved as well, and like everything was just like based in Greg's apartment at the very beginning of it for the first 4 or 5 months, and like you know people would be working there. Elon would come drop by and hang out, and um, it was interesting. Like I felt like one of the things that worked for it is like there were actually like relative constraints of people and resources going into it at that point to try
Hmm.
and come up with like the early like hewing theses of how this is going to work and how actually going to be able to make progress in the field. It
Yeah.
wasn't super clear cut at the beginning. It was just this that assemblage of like really, really great people.
Yeah.
uh, I think like in that first year or two, like, and I was only there for really close to the first year, but still stayed pretty close friends with them in those early years. But like those compute theses started to emerge around then, and like
Hmm.
obviously that ended up being a really breakthrough thing. But yeah, it was interesting how much of it still was just figuring out like how to be doing the right approach. And I think that ends up being true for startups broadly. I think that ends up being true for research labs broadly that are
Yeah.
coming together for some type of like ambitious end goal purpose. Like the path forward is not necessarily immediately obvious, and like you have to spend some time with friction against the block. And
Hmm.
obviously, that set of people was able to do that very effectively in the end. Um, and yeah, personally for me, it was like amazing to be able to learn so much from Sam and from, I mean, Greg was like such an amazing person to be learning from as well in terms of how
Hmm.
effective, like he did everything and started doing that organization building, which I really took to heart for everything I've done in the future, like the importance of the quality of like super, super excellent people.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was an awesome experience for me personally.
What are a few of the most important things you learned from, Sam Altman or Greg Brockman? Either one, I don't mind.
Yeah. I mean, Greg, the people thing for sure.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like the importance of like having like a really excellent recruitment engine
Hmm.
and like really tending to people and making them feel wanted and just going after the best people way more effectively than everyone else. Like
Right.
all your competitors or whatnot can make all the difference to building an excellent organization. Because like having someone that's like really, really excellent come join you is like one of the most high leverage things you can force to happen. Because yeah, you're basically taking that person who's incredibly capable on your team, aligning them towards goals that you think are super important. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's just off to the races when that type of thing can happen properly. So that's one thing from him I really took to heart. Um, Sam, I mean, everything from fundraising effectively to also trying to make sure you're pointed towards the right direction and goals as at like the highest level really allows a lot of other things like below that to fall into proper place. Um, uh, yeah, how to be like responsive, effective, be juggling multiple balls at the same time. Like,
Yeah.
uh, I don't know, like some of it's like hard to describe honestly, like
Yeah.
the small details, but really amazing, unique experience to get learning alongside such capable, effective people.
Absolutely. The responsive thing strikes me because every time I've had the opportunity to interact with Sam, it's like he's like, call me anytime in the next 4 hours. And I'm like, dude, why? Like, even I can't have a schedule that
Yeah,
open. And I'm like, I don't do anything as important as he does. So it's clearly like an underrated skill somehow that he's cultivated, is being extremely responsive. And
for
like,
sure.
do you try to do the same thing?
Yeah, I definitely. I get comments all the time about like how crazy it is, how
Uh-huh.
responsive I am for the most part. For me, like, we haven't really talked about it, but I also started this program called SciFounders to help scientists start
Mm-hmm.
companies. Like that type of responsiveness and just being on the ball is like one of the top things I look for in founders that
Mm-hmm.
end up wanting to fund.
Got it. Um, okay, so let's talk about that a little, like the Sci Founders thing, but like on a more abstract level, it seems like one of the core ways that R&D gets done now is via startups, right? Like it used to be seemingly like big industrial labs like Bell Labs or something, and then before that it was maybe like big government labs. But now it's like it's happening at the startup level, being funded by like private actors. So like why is that happening, first of all, and then second of all, like how do we make it more effective? Like how are you making it more effective with Sci Founders?
Yeah, I mean, part of it I think is like the structures in academia are fairly broken.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that sounds a little cliche to say, but I genuinely think there's some truth to it.
Yeah.
Part of it is that like the low hanging fruit problems that you can work on essentially by yourself on, or like a team of two people into the long term. Like a lot of that's been kind of addressed or figured out at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that like startups, the reason I like startups so much actually is I think they're really effective social coordination systems. Like it's easy to pick a goal to go after, communicate that to a team, get people working on a team effectively, and just by like how economic structures work, bring in funding for that type of thing as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's far easier to do all of those things than it is in an academic context at this point. In
Yeah.
an academic context, you've got people like thinking about their first author publications,
Mm-hmm.
and wanting to work in a silo for those reasons. You've got grad students and postdocs constantly going in and out over 4 or 5 years rather than really sticking there for a decade. Um, it's just very hard to be working on a team, and likewise, it's often hard to bring in funding, especially for very ambitious projects. You have to spend a lot of time writing grants, teaching classes. Um,
Right.
it's not to say there's not a place for academia. I still think
Mm-hmm.
there's really important things in the sciences that still occur in an academic context. But I do think for the really ambitious problems, it's easier to address as like a focused organization. And in most cases, or in many, many cases at least, that can mean a startup. I mean, with SciFounders, like the thing we're really trying to spread is just that idea that starting a company to translate research is actually promising, and
Mm-hmm.
often actually the best way to make sure like the trajectory of these companies actually reach their potential is for the founders to be in control. So we're really trying to screen for scientists that we think can make for good founders, and
Mm-hmm.
then if it's promising, they can grow into the types of leaders that can run their companies into the long term, because they tend to be a lot more motivated by the actual technology development and getting it out
Yeah.
there than just like the financial benefit
Right.
of
Monetization,
making a company
productization. Right.
public, selling it,
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think this is one of the best things Y Combinator did for the world, if not the best thing. It really
Mm-hmm.
showed like young software engineers, you don't need business people and stuff like that to get started with the company, and you can grow into a leader. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that idea has really percolated across scientists
Yeah.
nearly to the same level, at least beyond computer scientists.
Yeah.
So that's the mission there, is really help push that a little bit further.
How common do you think, or how rare rather, do you think that archetype is of a scientist who can also be this kind of like dictatorial founder guy or woman? Like it's
Yeah.
not, it's like a rare combination of traits. Do you
Yeah.
find them often?
Um, so I will say I don't think you have to be like dictatorial to be a good
Uh,
founder. I
right.
think there's different ways to be a good leader, but super rare overall though.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, we've had well over 1,000 applications for SciFounders, and we've funded less than 10 teams so far.
Mm-hmm.
Just because like we are really picky on trying to pick people that can do that. Like honestly, most scientists should not start companies, and
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean they shouldn't go work at a company. Like that could be more effective than staying in academia, but
Mm-hmm.
it does take a pretty rare intersection, and like
Mm-hmm.
I think that intersection is even rarer um, among scientists, because like unlike in computer science world, it's hard to contribute if like you're like 20 years old as like a founder. You haven't had enough time to build up that experience of actually being in the lab doing
Right.
work to know, like what good work is. So like some time in like a PhD program or going and working at a company after college for a couple of years, I think is important to like actually know what it's like to be doing good science, or at least getting good people around you that
Yeah.
meet that aspect. So it's rare to find those people that have like, been happy devoting 10 years to getting the right training
Mm-hmm.
and have the right effective coordination, fundraising, other types of soft skills that can really make for an excellent founder.
Right. Right. So you need someone who has had the broad patience to like, exist in like a PhD setting or whatever to gain these like deep technical skills, but then also is like ready to go at it and like start a company, right? So like what does that archetype look like? Like, can you name a few examples of I don't know, companies you funded that you thought were promising? What did you see in their founders?
Yeah. I mean, it's not like household names
Mm-hmm.
that we funded by any means because they're still,
Right, right.
just
Still very
into their
small. Mm-hmm.
trajectories. But yeah, I mean, it's not that different for those that are listening that are like in software startup world, at least. It's not that different for what you look for in an effective software founder. So
Mm-hmm.
you think of people like a Patrick Collison or a Sam Altman or something like that, like the types of like decisive traits and like, being very responsive, having an intuitive sense of what strategically makes sense to be going after as a milestone, able to recruit really excellent people to come work with you. It's those types of things still you want to see them growing into. It's just really the technical questions and day-to-day technology development look different than what you might expect in like a software company.
Right. Makes perfect sense. Okay, out of left field maybe, but are we gonna live forever? Is longevity fake? Like the field seems totally full of nonsense. Is there anything real in it? But
I don't think it's fake. I don't think we're going to live forever.
uh-huh.
Or at least I don't think it's going to be by biological means that anything like
Hmm.
that ends up happening. I personally wouldn't want to live forever for what it's worth, but
Sure. I just
uh,
mean more like euphemistically. Like, are we gonna double our lifespan? Is anything like that in the books?
it's really hard to say, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I do think like a lot of these companies that are saying they're longevity companies, they're actually working on like, a small enabling technology or like some type of therapeutic that's good for some set of indications. But yeah, the longevity wrapper, well, they might genuinely believe it. It's more like, useful for fundraising or something like that
Yeah.
compared to like actually some great leap forward. But I don't know. It's really hard to say. I think like sometimes in the life sciences, it's less deterministic than it is in other fields.
Yeah.
Like CRISPR is something that really came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
The original inklings of it was an academic scientist like studying types of bacteria and bacteriophage interactions, like
Right.
totally randomly, like no sense that this was going to lead to something that would be
Mm-hmm.
um, such an important tool and so promising for the future. So like there's still like just lots of random stuff that gets found in nature in the life sciences at least. And it's possible someone will make something that like, pushes the field forward in some unexpected way.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I say that, but on the flip side, like if you break down longevity into other things, like I do think we'll probably be able to cure almost every type of cancer in our lifetimes. I do think we'll be able to, manipulate things like cholesterol levels, and
Mm-hmm.
I, I'm hopeful we'll have like a better sense on neurodegenerative diseases.
Yeah.
So like I do think like the things that actually like kill people and really break them down, like individually as diseases, our tools are getting more powerful for addressing those, and I think we'll be able to do those things. But is there going to be like some
No
small
silver
molecule?
bullet. That. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Makes sense. Okay. I guess one last question for you. What books would you recommend to the audience?
What books would I recommend to the
Mm-hmm.
audience? I mean, if you want to learn more about bio type of stuff, as like a textbook, molecular biology of the cells, like a seminal uh, textbook to have a better understanding of what's going on. There's this author Mukherjee that writes a book called The Cell as
Mm-hmm.
well. And he just came out with a new book called, um, I think, Song of the Cell. Uh,
Interesting.
I haven't actually read that one yet, but yeah, it goes into actually a lot of the types of topics we're talking about and all the things cells are capable of, and um, yeah, how they can be manipulated into different states, and just like the development trajectory, going back to um, single cell organisms in terms of how we've gotten to where we are today. More broadly, I don't know. I like a lot of like historical books, memoir type things. Something I read recently that I thought was really, really great is this like collection of writings from Napoleon called Mind of Napoleon, where it's just like categorically going into different letters of his writings and the people around him's writings on specific different topics. And yeah, super fascinating book. So I don't know. I just read
That's
random
really
stuff.
cool. Awesome. Okay, well, thanks, Matt. I mean, that's all the questions I have. I think it's been great talking to you. Hope the audience has learned a lot about biotech and where we're going in the future. Thanks for your time, man. Hope you have a good day.
Yeah, you too. It was fun to meet you.